To kick things off, to what extent does the allocation of resources and attention to combating wildfires in Canada, particularly in Northwest Territories and BC, divert crucial resources and impact the preparedness and operational capabilities of the CAF for other national security challenges?
Well, for a government that has trumpeted its environmental awareness and climate change responsiveness, the Liberal government has done almost nothing to actually contribute to means of trying to mitigate the dramatic impact that environmental warming is having on the quality of life and the safety of Canadians. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, instead of having a dedicated emergency response organization that actually has some teeth, in other words, some people and equipment to respond in cooperation with the provinces, their default position is to go to the Canadian forces and dispatch them to assist with a variety of relatively mundane tasks, important nonetheless, but is it a task that the Canadian forces should be doing or has the resources to do so? All right, so let me answer the first question. Should it be doing that? Yes, if there's no one else available. And that's the current circumstance. Why? Because the federal government hasn't invested any resources or any thinking actually into creating specific emergency response organizations who have the funding and the appropriate equipment at the national level. Instead, they prefer to watch the provinces struggle to deal with it, and they step in with the Canadian forces, thereby getting the credit for sending the troops. And by the way, having the troops respond to natural disasters is very comforting to the local population because they get a sense of safety and security and a sense of relief that finally someone has showed up to give them a hand. So before I go any further, as a soldier, I've been involved in floods, ice storms, forest fires, searching for lost children, prison riots, assistance to the civil power and civil authorities, and the list goes on. A fairly typical response for a 35-year career. I've also worked at the provincial level as a region or an area commander was called in those days, where you're actively helping and advising the premiers and the legal authorities as to what capacity the armed forces might have in certain specific regions and how one should respond. To answer the question directly, this is a diversion of crucial resources at a time when the Canadian Armed Forces should be focused like a laser beam on addressing the 16,000 person shortfall in their ranks. And let's not forget what happens over there overseas can and does have an impact in Canada. We've got the Ukraine war raging. We've got Russia's ambitions, certainly not limited to Ukraine. We've got increasing tension with China. Africa is crying out for help, where hundreds of thousands are dying every week in terms of climate disasters, warlords, wars. And Canada has 25 peacekeepers overseas because that's the only capacity we can provide. That's 25, that's half a school bus.
What lessons have you learned through your involvement in various natural disaster relief efforts? And do you think any of these lessons can be applied or have been applied to enhance the overall operational readiness and agility of the CAF?
Yeah, so first of all, as a caveat, the provinces and territories have emergency response cells that actually do good work. They're very good at coordinating. A lot of them are ex-military, but not all. And the experience level within them is excellent in some cases, and in others it needs to be beefed up and they need more resources. At the provincial level, the machineries of government are well attuned to the process to go about asking for assistance. Likewise, the various military folk involved at provincial and federal level are extraordinarily good at seeing what the art of the possible is and what can and should be done. I would say my experience in terms of response to natural disasters is fairly typical, as I've mentioned, for a senior armed forces officer of 35 years experience. What is not typical is the rapidity of the natural disasters that climate change is causing in and within Canada. And something has to change because the circumstances have changed. So relying on the armed forces to respond to natural disasters is a stopgap measure because it takes them away from other stuff, which is increasingly important because the world is becoming a more dangerous place. And Canada has to be prepared to respond to protect our sovereignty, and cooperation with international friends and allies contribute to international peace and security. So what is needed is an organization that has the resources and the capacity and the capabilities to assist in provincial response, and where necessary to be directed by the federal government to actually go with their water bombers or crews to fight forest fires or experts to help shore up floods at the drop of a hat, which implies a full-time and part-time organization. That has not happened, and nor is there any thinking about it at the federal level.
How would we go about developing a national response unit to address wildfires and natural disasters, and what would that look like?
Well, all we can do, actually, there's many things we can do, but in the short term, all we can do is take a good look at the extraordinarily good examples that some of our best friends and allies have done. Be it Japan, be it Germany, be it France, and the list goes on. So this is not a new idea, but it's certainly a new idea to Canada because we've always been relatively secure in the knowledge that we had lots of space, and if there was forest fires burning, most of them weren't big and raging out of control to the extent they are now. We're getting increasingly concerned about the carbon footprint, of course, that forest fires produce, which is staggering amounts. And as well, we've got to do more to mitigate against the extraordinary temperatures that the nation is facing. And that has an impact on both, obviously, for floods, for the winter, for ice storms, for forest fires. And we're now seeing the direct result of this inability to see beyond their own navels and the lack of an emergency response organization, because we've got major towns and provincial capitals or territorial capitals being evacuated because there are insufficient resources to keep the dangers at bay. Really, it's all gets down to leadership. Leadership in the Prime Minister's office, leadership in the Finance Minister's office, it sort of stops there. The buck stops there. Nothing has happened to address this issue. Nothing has happened to plan for tomorrow when a whole bunch of yesterdays have shown the demand. So it's quite frustrating. Must be frustrating to Canadians. Must be frustrating to those people who've lost their homes. Yeah, the whole idea of an emergency response unit is not new. A variety of proposals have been submitted to the federal government over the last several years. It's been nothing but crickets chirping in the dark in terms of a response. There's a variety of options as to organize it. Is it within the Canadian Forces? Is it an adjunct to the Canadian Forces? Is it a standalone organization? My recommendation would be, in terms of the command and control and response required, an adjunct, in other words, a build-on to the Canadian Forces. It could be done quickly. It's going to be remarkably efficient. It'll be well utilized. A federal government's first responsibility, which sometimes they forget, is the safety and security of Canadians. So we have threats overseas, and we've got threats at home. So in the case of the Cold War of days gone by, it's getting a lot warmer and hotter with Russia and China and others. And by the way, the Cold War never existed at home per se, but it's certainly getting a lot hotter. And in both cases, internationally and domestically, the federal government, to my mind, is failing in its ultimate responsibilities to do that which it can to mitigate the dangers and risks to Canadians. So it's time for a change.
Thanks for joining us today, Mr. Leslie. I appreciate your insights. Next, we'll turn to Peter Kasurak, former Senior Principal for National Security in the Office of the Auditor General. Peter, thanks so much for joining me. Let's dive right in, shall we? I posed this question to Mr. Andrew Leslie, and I'll pose it to you as well. To what extent does the allocation of resources and attention to combating wildfires in Canada divert crucial resources and impact the preparedness and operational capabilities of the CAF for other national security challenges?
Well, it's actually fairly difficult to say, but my overall impression is that it's not much. When you look at the 30 some odd call outs for humanitarian and disaster relief incidents since 2010. Most of them are pretty small in terms of their draw on forces resources. There are only 3 that called for more than 2,000 troops, which are the Eastern Canada floods in 2019 and the Southern Alberta floods in 2013. So they're also fairly short duration. Most of them are less than 2 weeks. So those sorts of incidents really, they're disruptive, but they should not affect readiness very much. Now, there are some outliers that are important. The Red River floods of 1997 required 8,000 personnel to be deployed, and the ice storm in 1998 required 12,000 personnel to be deployed. So those are obviously huge impacts. And also during the COVID pandemic, while probably overall the forces were not affected by the humanitarian disaster relief deployments, the medical service certainly was. And they were not structured to provide that level of service, and they were really consumed by the pandemic. So you can have specialist resources that are hugely affected, but the CAF overall, not so much. Assuming that the policy remains the same, and Strong, Secure, Engage says that humanitarian disaster relief is one of the priority tasks of the forces, they really need to do more than treat it as an other related duty. I mean, there needs to be, the only dedicated portion of the regular force is the DART team, which is a company size force. So that's really pretty modest. And sort of the other response has been to turn this into a reserve task, which I think is sort of just shoving it off again. So if the forces want to, if by policy they are required to stay in the game, they should then organize themselves to do so, and that means some considerable regular force involvement as well as the reserves.
Should the government consider establishing a dedicated federal agency specifically designed to handle HADR missions, or should the CAF remain the primary responder? And what are the potential advantages and challenges of each approach?
Well, the short answer is the task has not been well enough defined for anybody to say for sure who should be at the center of it. Certainly, the CAF is not going to be able to back all the way out. For the really big disasters like Red River flood and ice storm, the demand for just labor is going to be so high that they're going to be involved. Also, when you look at the 30 some odd incidents the last 20 years, aviation has played a big role in that. And there is not going to be a civilian air force to support humanitarian and disaster relief. It's going to be the RCAF is going to have that job. So the CAF is not going to be able to back out completely. But until the actual job is better defined, what sort of civilian agency would be better is hard to say. The government has tried to take the low-cost option of encouraging NGOs to build more capacity. It's hard to say how successful this has been. It's been somewhat successful. They're putting more money in it. They're putting $80 million a year into it. But when you compare the current effort at trying to support volunteer resources with what is done elsewhere, like the German Technische Hilfswerk is often cited. That's an 80,000 person volunteer organization with a budget of $1 billion a year. And the Australian state emergency service organizations, New South Wales is 20,000 volunteers and about $150 million a year to support that. So we're talking about orders of magnitude larger, even if we're talking about a federally sponsored volunteer organization, much less something that would be a permanent freestanding federal organization.
How can the Canadian government enhance its whole of government approach to disaster management and ensure the effective coordination between different departments and agencies and optimize the resources of the CAF for situations that require such unique capabilities?
Well, I mean, I think the federal government has recognized that it would like to move the whole federal involvement from recovery and paying for disasters after the fact to mitigation. The Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangements program recently had an expert panel look at this, and they came up with a bunch of recommendations. But in essence, they wanted to prioritize what is actually required in terms of resilience measures and to move federal funding from recovery to mitigation. But to do that, I mean, it's not only multi-jurisdictional, but they suggested it was multi-sector as well, that the private sector would have to be more involved than currently. So yeah, there's a lot that can be done in terms of trying to move things into mitigation to try to reduce what's going to be required in terms of disaster relief. But I mean, we're still at the let's get together and talk stage, like to try to get any actual facts on what the actual requirement is and what the resources required would be at this stage is very difficult. I mean, from somebody that's sort of outside the government sector, it's really hard to say what the best solution is, although the general direction is clear.
How would you assess the provincial responses to ongoing wildfires, and does the federal government need to work on perhaps incentivizing the provinces to invest more in their own emergency response capabilities?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the federal government obviously sees that's what it would like to do, but there doesn't seem to be a lot being produced other than talk and reports. I mean, the federal government has made a number of initiatives over the last 10 years to try to get the provinces together to work on this. But when you look at the reports that have been produced, it's all, we need to develop a better plan. So what the federal government can do in addition, to me, is really not clear. I mean, there are genuine jurisdictional issues. The problem really is owned by the provinces. And given the state of federal-provincial relations, I'm not sure the feds can really go much farther than they actually have. I mean, there is a problem now with the sort of paying after the fact, and it creates an obvious moral hazard in terms of it's easy for municipalities and provinces to not take unpopular measures like preventing building on floodplains or moving people off floodplains, and then say, well, the feds will pay for it in the end anyway. So, I mean, that could be looked at to try to tighten the tap, but it's obviously a political problem for the federal government to do that.
Any final thoughts, Mr. Kasurak?
I guess my final thought is really, as far as the armed forces go, is that it really is time for them to consider this a priority task. I mean, the public at large is always going to expect the CAF to be there. And unless that is taken seriously by senior leadership, there isn't going to be a lot of change on this file.
Thanks for joining me, Peter. Pleasure having you on.